A large portion of the Jewish nation has returned to its homeland, but the heart, soul, and mind of much of the Jewish nation are still in exile mode. This state of affairs must and will inevitably change. This is Torah Nation TV from Jerusalem, and we are speaking with the head of Machon Shilo, Rabbi David Bar-Hayim. Shalom, Rabbi Bar-Hayim.
Shalom.
Amongst Ashkenazi Jews, there is a long-standing custom not to consume kitniyot, legumes, on Passover. Is this custom still binding?
Your question, the way that you word your question, implies that this custom was originally, at some point, binding, and perhaps today is not so. But I would disagree with that implication. It is my view that the custom amongst the Ashkenazim of not consuming Kitniyot during Pesach was never binding. And the reason for this is very simple. And we can divide the explanation as to why it was never binding into two, basically. First of all, we have the fact that the earliest mentions of this Minhag are to be found in medieval France, southern France and northern France. And amongst those Rishonim who mention it, such as the Baal Sefer Minhagot, Rabbeinu Asher Milunel, who was the first to mention this practice, amongst these Rishonim who mention this Minhag, the majority of them are against the Minhag. A majority of them mention that there are people who act in this fashion, but they themselves seriously question, and in fact very often outright cancel any possible halachic validity that such a minhag may have. We find that Rabbeinu Yeruham, also from the south of France, Provence, refers to it as a minhag shtut. Someone familiar with the literature of the Rishonim will understand that such a statement is very strong, very powerful language and very unusual. It is very difficult to find examples of a widespread minhag where a Rishon comes along and says this is a worthless and baseless minhag, which is in fact downright shtut, which means stupid, or without any rationale whatsoever. But the fact is, we find this statement repeated by other Rishonim as well. We find that Rabbeinu Shmuel Plais refers to this minhag, that he says that it seems to me this is a mistake, this minhag is a mistake. Also a very rare and unusual statement to hear from the lips of an Ashkenazi Rishon regarding a minhag which was already somewhat widespread, at least in his time. We find later that both the Rosh and his son the Tur come out explicitly against this minhag. They are fully aware of it, they refer to it. The Rosh, on the one hand, says and goes out of his way to say that it is permissible to eat all manner of legumes, kitniyot, including rice, on Pesach. His son, the Rabbeinu Yaakov Baal Turim, goes out of his way to stress that this is a humra yethera, an unnecessary stringency. This is a very important point, which I will speak more about in a moment. And therefore he comes down against the minhag. The fact that so many of the major Rishonim, so many of the major Poskim who were on the ground, who were familiar with this practice and familiar with the rationale given for this practice, and were aware of the fact that the essential and primary reason for this minhag, as mentioned in a number of sources, such as Maram Halwa, Talmid Rashba in his Chidushim HaMasechet Pesachim, and such as Rabbeinu Asher in his Sefer Minhagot, they explicitly state that those who have this minhag claim that kitniyot are a form of hametz, which is clearly impossible and clearly wrong. The fact that they knew these facts, were aware of the arguments for this minhag, and came down so clearly against it, the fact that in the Smak we find Sefer Misvot HaKatan, we find, and in the Mordechai we find it written explicitly that Rabbeinu Yahya Paris and Rabbeinu Yehuda Paris, two of the greatest of the Baalei Tosafot, ate kitniyot on Pesach, despite their awareness, their familiarity with this minhag. All this tells us that there is something fundamentally wrong and mistaken with regards to this minhag. And therefore, this minhag does not comply with the basic condition, and that is, now we move on to the second point. This minhag does therefore not comply with the basic condition laid down at the end of Perek Yudara, the 14th chapter of Masechet Soferim, where it states that a minhag is binding and meaningful when it has a Torah rationale behind it, when it can be explained in rational terms. But if it can be shown that it is based on a mistake or an error, and that the Vatikin, that is to say the great Chachamim, did not accept this minhag, then such a minhag has no standing whatsoever. So when Rabbeinu Yahya Paris, Rabbeinu Yudami Paris, Rabbeinu Shmuel Plais, when Maram Halua, and the Mordechai, and the Rosh, and the Tur, and Rabbeinu Yerucham all tell us that this is either a minhag shtuth or a humra yethera, which means this entire practice is unnecessary, mistaken, and based on some kind of historical error or some form of confusion that crept into Judaism. When we are told this by so many important and outstanding Torah sages, then we are not speaking about a minhag which complies with that basic requirement of all minhagim, to be reasonable, that is to say, to have some cogent Torah reasoning, some halachic reasoning behind it that can be explained, that is beyond reproach and beyond critical analysis. When so many people, so many Torah sages were opposed to a minhag, such a minhag is not binding. Furthermore, there is another consideration which is also very important in my view, and that is the statement in the Tashbetz. The Tashbetz is a book written by the Talmid Muvhak and Msharet of Maharami Rothenburg, the famous Rabbeinu Meir Rabbi Baruch in Rothenburg, one of the great Ashkenazi Rishonim. And he writes in Siman Taf Kof Lamed Zayin of his book Tashbetz, which is based on things that he heard and saw Maharami Rothenburg say and teach and do. In other editions it's Siman Taf Kof Mem, but the correct version is Taf Kof Lamed Zayin. There it states that, quoting the Yerushalmi Masechet Terumot, Kashem she'asur lahatir et ha'asur, kach asur le'esor et ha'mutar. Just as it is forbidden to say that which is forbidden is permissible, so it is forbidden. It should never be the case that a posek, that a halachic authority states that something which is permissible is in fact forbidden. Even though we don't have this statement in the Yerushalmi before us, this is an important statement, a very important and illuminating statement. It is not a simple matter to come along and tell people something, such and such a thing is asur, you must not do so. There has to be good reason, there have to be solid sources for something to be asur. And if you cannot produce those solid sources, if no convincing argument can be brought to bear regarding such a custom, then such a custom is not to be taken seriously. And I seriously wonder, I have wondered on many occasions, whether minhagim such as this one, which is clearly against halacha, which is clearly being oser davar hamutar, which is clearly stating that which is entirely permissible is in fact forbidden. If such minhagim do not distance many people from the Torah, does such a practice bring Jews closer to the Torah? Does such a practice bring our children and our friends and family who perhaps are not as observant as ourselves, does this bring them closer to the Torah? Or does it simply add to their impression that Judaism is full of inscrutable and unreasonable demands and prohibitions? And if only they were to know that in fact sometimes they are correct. Some of their impression that certain things in Judaism are unreasonable is in fact based on reality, on facts, then perhaps they would change their position regarding Judaism. This is a tragedy, that Judaism should be presented as something which makes all kinds of things asur, when in fact they are completely mutar. And therefore, seeing that this minhag is so dubious from its very inception, it was regarded as very dubious. Seeing that so many great Torah sages throughout history have been against it, and we see today to what it has led, to ever-increasing cycle of humrah and obsession with everything regarding Pesach and Kitniyot. Such a minhag must and should be dropped without further ado.
Thank you, Rabbi Bar-Hayim. We would like to suggest the following opportunity to our viewers. If you identify with Rabbi Bar-Hayim's message and would like to sponsor or dedicate a video interview with the rabbi in honor or memory of a loved one, if you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org.